Mother! At the crash of a flower pot, Betty switched off the TV, plunging the living room into eerie silence. I've told you to throw out all these stupid flower pots. A series of violent knocks on the door followed his yelling. Open this door before I break it down. In the twinkle of an eye, Betty's quiet afternoon took a nosedive. She remained frozen at the door, trying to calm her frantic heart as Dave continued to pound relentlessly on the door. Mother! Dave yelled again. Open this door, or I swear to God! At his threat, Betty wheeled her chair to the door and twisted the key. She got out of the way just in time for David to swing the door open, and it banged against the wall, missing her wheelchair by a fraction. With her heart in her throat, she looked up at Dave as he came in, wondering when her life became such a train wreck. Dave slammed the door shut again, and her heart rose to her throat because it felt like being caged in with the devil, and there was no way out. She started to wheel her chair towards her room, but a violent force yanked her back, and she held onto the armrests for dear life. Where do you think you're going? Dave breathed down his mum's face, and she recoiled. He smelled of weed, alcohol, and a mixture of other substances she didn't care about. It wasn't a pleasing odour, and she should be used to it by now because it was a regular occurrence. Yet, she could never adapt to the staleness and stench that always clung to him. Dave glared down at her, and she shook her head at him, her heart beating like a drum. Dave, stop, she said weakly, but he didn't listen. When has he ever? Stop, he yelled. Stop! With every word that came out of his mouth, the volume of his voice increased until he was hollering. I've been knocking for a minute, he growled, and you sat here watching television like I wasn't important. I'm sorry I didn't hear you. Betty shook her head, imploring him to believe her. I came to the door as soon as I heard you knock. Ugh! Dave swayed on his feet, and liquid sloshed out of the rim of the bottle he was holding. You are so annoying. You knew I would be coming home, yet you turned the TV volume up so you wouldn't hear me? He laughed maniacally. Well, newsflash, woman, he scowled at her. I am back. I will always come back. You cannot get rid of me. Betty didn't respond because responses always got Dave angrier, but she wondered why he would think she wanted to get rid of him. Firstly, as someone who was permanently restrained. To a wheelchair, it was impossible to physically hurt Dave, who was 5'10" and looked over 200 pounds. Secondly, he was her son. No matter how frightening he would always be her baby. Her heart hurt seeing him like this, but this was her life now. Dave tipped the bottle into his mouth and gulped down its contents. I wish you would die, he said, holding her gaze again. Although she didn't respond, Dave got even more furious. I wish you would die, he said. Why won't you just die so I can be free of you? Betty shrunk into the wheelchair as Dave stalked towards her, his eyes wild with hate. Since becoming a teenager, she and Dave never had a great relationship. He preferred to toe the wrong side of the law, and she would always restrain him with words and actions. This made him detest her. It became worse when she got into an accident 5 years ago and became paralyzed. It put her at Dave's mercy, and he showed just how much he hated her. You can be free of me, Dave, Betty said. I try not to be a burden to you. You can do whatever you want. I'm not. Dave clamped her jaw between his fingers and squeezed so hard she feared he would shatter her mandible. Her eyes watered with pain, and she tried to pull away, but she was no match for him. You being alive is a burden to me, Mother. He spat the words like poison, and it crawled across her skin like a virus. I want you dead. Why won't you die? His words were harsh, but Betty didn't let it sink into her skin. It bounced off, only chipping at the surface. I still have a lot to live for. Dave's brows arched for a moment before he burst into laughter. He laughed so hard that he stumbled back, an arm wrapped around his stomach. "A lot to live for?" he asked. "What do you have to live for, Mother?" he asked. "You're paralyzed," he added. "You struggle to even wash your ass." Betty flinched at his harsh words, but Dave wasn't done. "You will never have peace in this world," he said. "Death is the only way out. Kill me then." He reared back, unused to her standing up for herself. Betty cowered at the look in his eyes, convinced she had finally tipped him over the edge. Instead, he cackled and took several steps away from her. "Maybe one of these days," he said, "maybe one of these days, I'll look at you and finally decide your time is up." He sounded so confident a sliver of fear slid down Betty's back. "Until then, I suggest you tread carefully, Mother, or else you might just make your time come faster." He flung the bottle at the walls and it splintered into tiny shards that flew in every direction. Betty screamed in fright, and Dave cackled as he walked out of the living room and disappeared into his room. She only breathed a sigh of relief when he slammed his door shut. She knew from experience that he would remain in his room until late evening before leaving the house again. Betty glanced around her, at the glass shards that littered the living room and the brown alcohol stain on the wall. When did her life become this hopeless? She slid her gaze towards Dave's shut door, and before she could help it, tears streamed down her face in torrents. She bit down on her bottom lip, trying to rein in the tears, but it didn't help. The tears burgeoned into sobs, and before she knew it, her body started to shake and tremble with sorrow. Dave was her miracle child, a wonder that the universe gave her after years of aching and waiting to become a mother. Betty had always loved children, so when she married at 22, it was one of the highlights she was looking forward to. 5 years passed and no child came. She started to get aggravated, and so did Jack, who also wanted kids. For her, being a young mom was important, and so she started undertaking various procedures and just anything to help her conceive. After 7 years in a relationship with Jack, they finally separated. Several tests concluded that she was the problem, something about a scarring on the cavity of her uterus. Jack got tired of waiting, and their 7-year relationship dissolved. At the time, she was already 27 years old and desperate for a child. It didn't matter if it was a girl or a boy. Nothing else mattered except having a child of her own. Her desperation pushed her into another marriage, and this time it was with Harley. While she had loved Jack, she barely tolerated Harley, but he was a man, and she needed him to give her a child. She was already on medications, and the doctors said there was a chance she could conceive. She didn't. After 5 years with Harley, they separated without children. These were years of pain, suffering, aching, and waiting. Yet it yielded no results. That same year, she fell into depression, which led her to become an alcoholic. She turned to alcohol to drown her pain and was constantly drunk, so she didn't have to think about how she was almost 40 without a child of her own. All her friends already had kids, and some were getting ready to be grandparents even. Months after her separation from Harley, she met Zane at a club, and they formed a casual relationship, only meeting up weekly to satisfy their sexual urges. Months after meeting Zane, she fell ill and headed to the hospital for a test. To her shock, the doctor told her she was pregnant. Even now, 21 years later, she could still remember how ecstatic she was. Of course, when she told Zane he disappeared, it hurt, but no one could really blame him, especially since they were only together for the sex. She didn't even know his last name or where he lived. He wanted her to terminate the pregnancy, but Betty blatantly refused. There was no way she would do that, not after waiting forever for this child. Throughout the pregnancy, Betty feared something would go wrong, but David arrived 9 months later as a healthy baby boy. Her world was finally complete, and Dave became the center of it. He never lacked anything, as she would rather starve or suffer to afford anything he wanted. Growing up, Dave had the best toys and ate the best food. On his birthdays, she threw the largest parties to celebrate his existence. It was just her and Dave, so they were as close as a parent and child could be, especially since he knew he had her wrapped around his fingers. All he had to do was ask. Trouble started setting in when Dave grew into his teenage years. Some days he would disappear from home and not return until almost a week later. Then there was him missing classes, failing tests, and generally being a nuisance to everyone, especially his mother. In the beginning, Betty was so hurt. She didn't understand why Dave would not listen to her, or why he would yell at her and break things whenever he didn't get his way. At 15 years old, Dave dropped out of school and started doing hard drugs. He would smoke until the house was thick with smoke, and then drink until he could no longer stand on his own. It was at the time Betty knew that something had gone wrong with him, but it was too late to fix it. She was afraid to speak to him because whenever she did, he always got violent. He never hit her, but she always felt like one day he would. The day came in that same year, a few months after her accident. Dave had been involved in a small-scale mall robbery and was identified by the store owner, Mr. Jenkins. Before calling the police, Jenkins called and threatened that he would make sure Dave was arrested and locked up if his stolen items weren't returned. She tried to talk to Dave, but as usual, he wouldn't listen. Rather than risk him being arrested, she got a check and headed to Jenkins' store. On her way home after the refund, her car was T-boned by a truck, and Betty woke up in the hospital in pain. The accident paralyzed her from the waist down, and she spent 6 months in the hospital to get her life back. During these 6 months, she didn't see Dave. He never stopped by to see her, nor did he call to check on her. When she was discharged, she went straight to hell. Dave had taken over the house and sold everything they had. The only thing left were the beds in the rooms and a single couch in the living room. When she asked why, he said, "I thought you were going to die. Someone said the accident was pretty serious." She had thought it was a joke, but things went downhill, and Dave got out of control. He would lock her in the room whenever his friends came over because she embarrassed him. Dave would steal her money and empty her accounts until she secretly opened another to keep her money safely. Whenever she complained about his smoking or drinking, he would punish her by locking her inside her room without food or water for days. To keep her safety and sanity, she had to leave him alone and learn to look away when he did debauched things. Without her breathing down his neck, Dave went completely wild until she was no match for him anymore. He hit her for the first time a year after her accident. He had come home drunk in the middle of the night, and it was a struggle to leave her bed and climb into the wheelchair to open the door. On that night, her legs were sore, and it had taken her about 30 minutes to get to the door while Dave violently knocked. The moment he stepped into the house, he struck her across the face and stormed into his room, cursing and yelling as he went. He woke up the following day without an apology, and life continued. Since that day, he became physically abusive, and Betty went out of her way to avoid him. There was a physiotherapist whom the hospital assigned to come over twice a week to massage her legs and take her through some exercises, but after Dave threatened to beat him up, he stopped coming. She had to learn to massage her legs herself, and she was doing a poor job of it because her limbs were always stiff and painful. But her house was a lion's den, and no one was willing to come close. Her life was miserable. It had been that way for years. Dave was right, though. What was she living for? But even as she asked herself the question, she knew the answer. It was Dave. The only reason she was still holding up to this wretched life was Dave. She had hopes that one day he would change, and she wanted to witness it. She still loved Dave more than anyone else in the world. He was still the center of her world, and no matter how much he hurt her, She could never hate him, nor did she want to. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds. Betty sat motionless in her wheelchair. The television was on, the volume low, providing a faint background murmur that neither distracted nor entertained. She was lost in thought, a common state these days, as she waited for Dave to come home. For years, Betty had wrestled with the reasons behind his aggression, initially believing that her excessive leniency had spoiled him. During a particularly fierce argument, Dave's painful accusation rang out. "You just don't get it, do you, Mom?" Dave's voice was thick with anger. "If you were actually a good person, maybe I'd have a dad." Betty's heart clenched. Dave's words sliced through her, raw and accusing. She remembered the countless times he had inquired about his father as a child, the innocent eyes filled with curiosity. Now those eyes were hard and accusing. The truth was that Dave had never known his father. As a child, he frequently peppered Betty with questions about the man, but she, hindered by the shadowy circumstances of her pregnancy, had little information about whether his father was even alive. She had always deflected these inquiries, hoping to shield both Dave and herself from the painful void his absence created. I've always done the best I could for you, Dave," Betty stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She gripped the arms of her wheelchair, feeling trapped not just by her physical limitations, but by the past she had tried so hard to bury. "I never knew much about your father. After he left, "Stop lying," Dave interrupted, slamming his fist against the wall. "I know there's more. You always dodge the truth." Betty flinched, the loud bang reverberating like a gunshot in her ears. She took a deep breath, the weight of years of secrecy pressing down on her. "Dave, I've never told you much about your father because I don't know much myself. It was a difficult time and he wasn't around after I found out I was pregnant. So you're saying you don't even know where he is, or if he's alive?" Dave's voice was laced with disbelief and hurt. Betty nodded, her eyes moist. "Yes, and I'm so sorry that has hurt you." Dave looked away, his jaw clenched. "You know, people say stuff. They say he left because he didn't want a kid, that I was the mistake he ran away from." Betty's heart broke hearing these words. "Oh, Dave, no, you were never a mistake. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "Ryan didn't have a... Why didn't you try to find him?" Dave's voice was a whisper, vulnerable. Betty hesitated. She knew Dave's father wanted to have nothing with the child, but she couldn't say it like that. "I thought it was better this way, to protect you from possible rejection." Betty's voice trailed off. The room fell silent. The tension hanging thick in the air, Betty took a deep breath, each word she chose carrying the weight of years of unsaid truths. "Dave, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything you've gone through. Maybe I should have been more open about it all, but I was scared. Scared of dredging up a past that could hurt us more than it already has." Dave stopped pacing and looked at his mother. Betty could see the little boy he once was, confused and longing for answers. The shrill ringing of Ryan's phone had him rolling off the bed and reaching for the device on the bedside table. However, when he saw the name on the display, his heart dropped. He expected the caller to be Grandpa, but it wasn't. Instead, it was Randy, his friend, calling. He stared at the ringing phone momentarily, contemplating whether to take the call. Eventually, he let it go to voicemail because he was too disappointed to speak to anyone. He fell back on the bed, wondering if it was the right time to call Grandpa. When he called 2 days ago, his call had gone unanswered, but he'd gotten a text from him telling him he'd be home today. It was already evening, and there was no sign of him. A moment later, he decided to call him. He would rather call and be disappointed than keep hoping his grandfather would show up and have his hopes dashed. He dialed his number and held his breath while it rang. When he thought the call would go unanswered, someone picked up. "Hello?" Upon hearing the feminine voice that answered, Ryan paused. "Ryan." "Miss Kelly." "Yes, Ryan, how are you today?" "I'm fine." Ryan sighed. "I want to speak to my grandpa," he said. "Immediately, please." When Miss Kelly sighed, Ryan knew he was about to be disappointed. In fact, he steeled himself for it. "I'm so sorry, Ryan, but Pete cannot answer the phone right now. He's in a meeting." Ryan shook his head. No matter how many times he got disappointed, it still hurt. There was no getting used to this. It was confirmed. Grandpa would not be coming home today. The awareness sank in, and Ryan realized he would spend the night alone. Again. At this point, he should be used to loneliness. He had always been on his own because since his parents died in an accident when he was 4 years old, he had lived with Grandpa, who was a workaholic. Grandpa was hardly home and would leave Ryan at home alone. From a young age, he learned to be independent because there were no options. Although Grandpa Pete ensured that Ryan didn't lack anything he needed, he was never present. The only reason Ryan was not wholly alone was Mike, his companion. Mike wasn't a human being. He was a crow Ryan rescued from the hands of a cat years ago. At the time, Mike was 11 and was fortunate to be in the bush when he saw the crow whose wings were broken. Much to Grandpa Pete's mortification, Ryan took the bird home and nursed him back to good health. When the crow was healed entirely, Ryan let him back out, but it wouldn't fly away. Instead, it lived on the tree behind the house and would occasionally disappear for hours but always return home. After 1 week of living in Ryan's backyard, he named the crow Mike. Having experienced utter loneliness with Grandpa Pete, Ryan appreciated Mike's presence and would take him everywhere and teach him things. He had been begging Grandpa for a dog, but when Mike came, he didn't want one anymore. Mike was everything he needed in a pet. Whenever Grandpa wasn't home, Ryan would bring Mike into the house and teach him tricks, using nuts as treats. Everyone advised him against getting too close to Mike, claiming that crows are wild birds and that one day Mike would fly away and never return. It's been 10 years, and the most Mike has been away from home is 1 day. He always came back. As if aware of Ryan's melancholic train of thoughts, Mike swooped in through the open window and landed on the sill with a loud caw. "Hello," he said. Chuckling, Ryan sat up on the bed and held out his arm. Mike flew off the windowsill and landed gracefully on Ryan's curved arm. "Where have you been?" Ryan asked, trailing a finger affectionately over the bird's head. "I came outside looking for you, and you weren't there." The crow cawed again, and Ryan pulled out the drawer and took out a nut. Mike instantly grabbed it with his beak and began to chew on it. "I guess it's just you and I today again," Ryan said to Mike. "Grandpa isn't coming home tonight." At his words, Mike raised its head and looked up at Ryan with twinkling dark eyes. So many times Ryan felt like Mike understood what he was talking about. Its eyes were so intense, so perceptive, it comforted Ryan and helped ease some of his disappointment. Ryan's phone rang again, and he reached for it, hoping it was Grandpa. A sense of déjà vu descended upon him when Randy's name flashed on the screen. With a tired sigh, he picked up the call. "Do you want to hang out later at the skate park?" Randy asked. "And please don't bring that bird. Everyone is afraid of it. I don't know why you take it everywhere," Ryan added. Irritation swirled in Ryan's belly. Mike wasn't a monster, so he didn't understand why they feared him. The statement annoyed him so much that he decided not to see Randy at all. "Sorry, Randy, I can't make it to the park today." As if on cue, Mike coughed, and it was a perfect mimic of the human cough. Ryan bit back a laugh. "Was that your bird?" Randy shrieked. "That's terrifying, man. A crow shouldn't be able to do that." Before Ryan could respond, Randy ended the call. Ryan burst into laughter while shaking his head at Mike, who cawed and flew off his arm towards the window. Growing up with Mike gave him enough time to teach the bird so many tricks. Astoundingly, the bird picked up many human words and cues. It was terrific. Ryan pushed off the bed and stretched his tired limbs, his stomach rumbling with hunger. "Come on, Mike." He walked out of the room and headed to the kitchen. "Let's make ourselves dinner." Ryan didn't remember his parents much, and the thought saddened him. He had vague memories of parents who doted on him, and then there was the terrible accident that claimed their lives. Most of his memories started in Grandpa's house, and there was nothing special about those until Mike came into the picture. Ryan did not doubt that Grandpa Pete loved him and always ensured he provided everything he needed. But Ryan had come to realize that he needed more than gifts and money. He wanted companionship. He was so affected by the loneliness he grew up in that he no longer knew how to make friends. Even in school, he alienated everyone and preferred his own company. He would be in college in a few years, and Ryan hoped he could get over his antisocial tendencies before then. Above all, he wished he and Grandpa would be able to spend more quality time together until he had to move away. "Mother!" Betty jumped, her heart expanding painfully in her chest. Whenever Dave called her this way, it was a prerequisite for something terrible. It was only 9 in the morning, and she had yet to leave the bed. These days she realized that mornings were drearier than usual. The setting of the sun only brought pain and sadness, and it was becoming apparent that life wasn't going to get any better. "Mother!" Dave banged the door again. "Don't make me come in there." "I'm coming," she said weakly, and pulled herself out of bed and into the wheelchair. Her body felt heavier, and the dead weight of her legs made it almost impossible to carry herself. Yet she persevered through the pain and finally settled into the chair. "That's it!" Dave yelled from the other side of the door. "I'm coming in!" Before Betty could respond, she heard a loud bang as the lock gave way and the door swung open, hitting the wall with an explosive crack. Dave stood in the doorway, his eyes wild with anger, and when they rested on her, it felt like the devil himself had taken over him. She wheeled her chair back, but it hit the edge of the bed, blocking her escape. "Why isn't there breakfast in the kitchen?" Dave stormed into the room, and when he got closer, Betty noticed a lit cigarette in his hands. It was barely noon, and he was already drunk. He stopped before her and grabbed her with the other hand, tightening and tugging until tears sprang to her eyes. "I could not get out of bed because my legs hurt," she cried. "Please let me go." "If you would rather stay alive than die, I prefer you be useful to me." He flung her away and she grabbed the armrests of the wheelchair to keep from sliding off. "You are my mother. It's your job to make me breakfast. Don't you ever forget that." "Dave, we're down on cash," Betty yelled, exhausted by his attitude. "Check the kitchen cabinets. There is nothing in there. We're done. There's no food." Dave stared at her for a moment before throwing his head back with laughter. "You mean to tell me you are broke?" he asked, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "You can't afford to feed your son?" "I am disabled, David. Where do you expect me to find cash to feed you?" "Oh, I see." Dave nodded and stormed towards her closet, his mouth closing around the cigarette. "Dave!" Betty wheeled her chair towards him and held onto his arm as he flung her closet door open. Dave growled and pushed her away, causing her to slide against the wall. She groaned in pain, but Dave didn't even look her way. She watched as he dug through clothes she no longer wore to grab her bag at the bottom of the wardrobe. Her heart started to pound because she knew that if he found the cash she had stowed there, he would be very upset. Seconds later, her fear materialized when Dave fished through the bag and discovered wads of cash. He took a drag of his cigarette, and his eyes turned bloodshot. At this point, Betty didn't care about the cash anymore. She just wanted him to leave. He didn't. Instead, he sauntered towards her, boxing her against the wall. "You are useless to me," he said, blowing smoke into her face. "You would rather I starve than give me some money." He shook the wads of cash in her face. "You should die." Somehow his words hurt today. They didn't bounce off like they always did. She was going soft. "I don't owe you anything, Dave," she spat. "I've done everything I can for you. Now I cannot. It's time for you to be responsible for yourself." His eyes widened with surprise, like he didn't believe she dared to speak back. When his shock wore off, he raised his arm, and Betty thought he was going to hit her. Instead, he yanked the cigarette from his mouth and stubbed it against her arm. She screamed with pain and yanked her hand away from him. There was satisfaction in his eyes at the pain he caused her, and Betty knew that she could no longer defend him. Dave was gone, and in place was a devil who was out to kill her. She had to get away from him. "Thank you for the cash, Mother," Dave cackled and left the room, leaving disarray and a broken heart. Betty stared at the burn on her arm, but the pain in her heart was more than the physical pain it caused. As the door slammed, alerting her to Dave's exit from the house, Betty knew she had to leave, or else it would be a stab to the heart next time. "Mike, stop!" Ryan swatted Mike away as he swooped down to grab his shirt. Mike cawed in Ryan's ears and tugged at his shirt again. "Mike!" Ryan groaned. "Can you stop?" He sat up on the swing and set his book down to glare at the bird who had perched on the overhead tree. He was in the backyard, reading a book and trying to unwind for the afternoon. Grandpa wasn't back yet, and Ryan craved human interaction, but the closest one to get that right now was by reading a book. He had grabbed one of his favourite thrillers and went to the swing in the backyard to read, but Mike had other plans. As soon as Ryan settled down, he started to pelt small pebbles at him. He stopped for a while after Ryan gave him a warning, but continued by swooping down from the tree and tugging Ryan's shirt. Ryan knew what Mike wanted, but he was too tired to respond to his request. "Mike, can you chill out?" He groaned when Mike came at him again. "It's too sunny to go for a walk. We can do it later this evening, okay?" Mike cawed again and threw a pebble, hitting Ryan square on the forehead. "Mike!" Ryan rubbed the spot. He looked up at the bird, his heart melting when Mike's black eyes blinked at him. "Fine!" Ryan stood. "Let's go." Mike perched on Ryan's shoulder, and together they lumbered down the bush path that snaked through Ryan's backyard. It was Mike's favourite path, probably because he got to nibble on fruits and seeds along the way. It's a little sunny, as Ryan complained earlier, but walking with Mike was always a good sport. So off they went. As Betty stuffed clothes into her luggage, she sobbed hard, her shoulders shaking from tears. She had already put everything in place, and all she had to do was leave the house and head straight for the train station. She still had a few more hours until Dave returned home, and she hoped to be long gone by then. Every month, the government paid her some benefits, and she had saved up some money in her new account, fortunately still intact since Dave had no access to it. She didn't know where she wanted to go or what she should do. All she knew was that she had to leave this hellhole before Dave took her life. After packing her luggage, Betty checked beneath her pillow, where she kept a $100 note. With this, she would pay for a seat on the train and buy snacks to eat before thinking of the next step to take. All she knew was that she wanted to leave and move somewhere safe. Her luggage was packed, and cash was in hand. She was set to go. Betty wheeled out of the room, wondering how she would survive the harsh reality of travelling alone as a disabled person. She had no help, and people weren't generally kind to disabled people out there. But that wouldn't stop her. She approached the door and was about to twist the knob when she heard that pound of footsteps outside the door. She froze, her eyes wide. Who could it be? Betty was still mulling this when the door swung open and Dave appeared at the doorway. Goosebumps riddled her body when Dave's roaming gaze landed on her luggage. Silence ensued between them until David stepped in and slammed the door shut, blocking her means to freedom. "Where do you think you are going, Mother?" Ryan and Mike had a familiar route they always took on their walks, but today Ryan decided to do something different. When he got to a fork in the road, instead of taking his usual left route, they took the right. This led them to a residential area featuring low-cost houses. Ryan wouldn't call himself wealthy, but he never lacked anything, nor did he live in houses like those thanks to Grandpa. As he walked down the row of houses, he heard a scream. Ryan paused, and so did Mike. He looked around him and contemplated whether he heard or imagined the noise. Suddenly, Mike made a loud caw and flew into the sky towards the house on the left. Ryan started after him. Mike. Problem with letting Mike fly without constraints, but this was a residential area, and humans were generally wary of crows. He gasped when Mike swooped into the house from an opening in the rooftop. As Ryan hurried to the house, he heard screams from within, followed by loud caws that were obviously from Mike. "Mike!" he shouted, jiggling the knob. But the door refused to open. "Ah!" a man screamed, and Ryan banged the door harder. "Get this freaking bird off of me!" "Mike!" Blood roared through his ears. Mike had never attacked anyone before, and it was surprising that he just whipped into a stranger's house. When the noise from within intensified, Ryan squared his shoulder and rammed it against the door. It gave way immediately. Mike was attacking a man who seemed to be a little older than Ryan. There was a wheelchair-bound woman beside them, her eyes streaked with tears and shock. "Mike!" Mike flapped his wings against Dave's face while tapping his strong beak on his face, leaving bloody puncture marks on the skin. The man kept shrieking while trying to swat Mike off his face, but the bird was quick and nimble in avoiding the man's flailing arms. "Mike!" Ryan tried to reach the bird, but Mike was stubborn and relentless in his attack. "Get this bird off me!" the guy yelled, heading for the open door. He raced out into the sun, with Mike attacking him as he ran. Now that they were out of there, Ryan had enough time to take in the premises. The house's interior was shabbier than the exterior, and Ryan frowned at the stains on the wall. "Who are you?" Ryan glanced at the woman in the wheelchair, shocked at the state she was in. He hadn't really noticed it at first, but she was silently sobbing, her shoulders shaking with the force of her tears. Ryan hurried towards her. "Please don't cry, my name is Ryan," he said, crouching in front of her. "Who was that guy? Was he attacking you?" As he spoke, he noticed a jagged wound on the woman's neck, and gasped, "He did this to you?" The woman sobbed harder, and in her eyes Ryan saw fear and resignation. "Do you have a first aid box?" "You should leave," the woman said in a hoarse voice. "If he returns, he might attack you." Ryan rolled his eyes. He wondered who the guy was and why he had been attacking the woman, but right now she didn't seem in the right state of mind to tell tales. "Don't worry about me," he answered. "Do you have a first aid box?" "It's in the kitchen. Bottom drawer." Ryan grabbed the box from the equally decrepit kitchen and returned to the woman in the living room. The living room door was wide open, and Ryan reached out to shut it. The woman jumped, her eyes wide with fear. Ryan was offended by the look in her eyes. "I won't hurt you, I promise," he said softly. "I just want to help. Look." He raised the first aid box up. "I won't hurt you." He took tentative steps towards the woman, and when she didn't move, he set down the box and started to clean her wound. As he worked, his heart broke. Her hands were shivering, and there were several burns and scars on her skin. "What's your name?" he asked the woman, wishing he could hug her frail body and assure her everything would be all right. "Betty Hampton." They heard the flurry of movement ahead and turned to see Mike swooping in from outside. Betty's eyes widened and Ryan chuckled. "He won't hurt you. I'm Ryan, and his name is Mike." "He's a crow!" Betty exclaimed. "Yes," Ryan nodded. "And my best friend." To his surprise, Betty smiled, gazing at Mike, who had perched on the table beside them. "I've never seen anything like that before." "Well, what can I say?" Ryan put a plaster on the clean wound and closed the box. "There's a first time for everything." Ryan tended to the wounds, making an effort to lighten the mood with some small talk. He shared the story of his first meeting with Mike. Betty listened intently, her interest evident in her focused gaze and occasional nods. As he spoke, Ryan glanced out the window, checking for any sign of the man. Seeing that he was gone, he turned back to face Betty. For a moment, he simply stood in silence, searching her expression for a reaction, the weight of their situation momentarily suspending further conversation. Betty sighed and wheeled her chair to the open window adjacent to where they stood. Ryan walked towards her but still gave her space to be alone. "That was my son," she said in a soft voice. "His name is Dave." Ryan said nothing, and the woman shook her head. "He would have hurt me really bad or even killed me if you didn't come in." "Why?" Ryan could no longer hold back. "What did you do to him?" The woman turned her chair towards him. "I birthed him." "What?" Ryan frowned. "What do you mean?" "I don't want to burden you with my story, Ryan," she said. "Don't worry about me." Ryan shook his head and closed the distance between them. "He was attacking you. I want to know why." By the time Betty finished her story, Ryan was visibly angry. He retrieved his phone from his pocket and started to call the police. Betty's eyes widened when he put the phone to his ear. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm calling the police," he said, and she started to shake her head, tears falling down her face. No, they're going to take him away." "They need to take him away," Ryan said unapologetically. "For your safety, please." When Betty didn't respond, Ryan reported the ordeal to the police and had Betty call out the address. When the call ended, he smiled at her. Betty was broken. "I'm a terrible mother. I caused this. I should have raised him better." "It's not your fault, Betty," Ryan argued. "You gave him everything he needed. You did your best. It's time for him to face the consequences of his actions." Betty looked into his eyes, a frown on her face. "How old are you, Ryan?" "So, I am 17. She smiled, but the gloominess remained in her eyes. "Your mother must have done something right." Ryan smiled. "I wish I had one." "What do you mean?" Her eyes shone with genuine curiosity. "I don't really remember my mother," Ryan answered. "She died when I was 4. I lost my dad too in the same accident." She gasped and reached out to smoothen the back of his hair. It was such an affectionate and motherly touch that Ryan almost leaned into it. "I'm so sorry," she said. "That must have been so sad." "I guess." Ryan shrugged. "I don't really remember them, but I always wish they were here." He rose to his feet and looked around the room. The floor was scattered with broken glass shards, and there was a deep brown stain on the floor, and just a general disorder that made his skin crawl. He couldn't believe that Dave had lived here with his paralyzed mother and let her fester in all this dirt. "I'm going to clean up a little," Ryan said. No, Betty shook her head. "I can't let you do that." "Come on," Ryan laughed. "Let me help, please." Before Betty could argue further, Ryan fetched a sweeper from the kitchen and started to wipe dirt on the floor. Betty remained at the window, looking out with glassy eyes that told stories Ryan did not fully understand. By the time the police arrived, the house looked a little cleaner. The stains on the wall could not be cleaned, but the room appeared better. Betty told the police everything that happened and how Dave would always attack and abuse her. Ryan was a witness to the recent abuse, so he gave his statement and the police promised to take up the case. "You can't leave her alone," Ryan said when the policemen started to leave. "Dave could return. He's very violent and he tried to kill her." The policeman smiled. "We will send a patrol team to secure the house tonight. Don't worry, we've got this." "Why are you helping me?" Betty asked when the policeman left. She looked genuinely confused and didn't understand why Ryan was helping out. "I just want to," Ryan said. "You need help." Ryan stayed with Betty until the police returned 2 hours later. Betty got the news of Dave's arrest the following day. She was still lying in bed when someone knocked on her door. At first, she was terribly afraid, thinking Dave was back to torment her. But then she remembered that the police were on watch outside her door, and there was no way Dave would get in without notice. She wheeled her chair to the door, wrapping shaky fingers around the armrests of her wheelchair as she went. "Who is it?" "Officer Jack." "Good morning, ma'am." "Oh." Betty heaved a sigh of relief and pulled the door open. Officer Jack was one of the officers who questioned her yesterday, and he bowed gently when he saw her. "How are you today, Mom?" "I'm fine." Betty forced a smile on her face. Was she really fine? She wasn't sure. Since Ryan left last night, she had been floating on a cloud, her feelings locked away. She hadn't allowed herself to feel for Dave because she knew she would cry if she did. "Your son Dave has been arrested," Officer Jack said softly. Betty waited until the officer entered the vehicle and drove away before shutting the door. Alone, she realized it would be this way for a long time. No longer would she fear Dave barging into the house drunk and violent. She no longer feared being locked in her room because Dave was offended by something she did. She was truly alone now, and somehow it felt refreshing. When she realized she didn't feel pain or loss, tears sprang to her cheeks. Was she that terrible as a mother that she couldn't even feel an iota of remorse for her son's arrest? She didn't have it in her to ask precisely what Dave would be charged for, but from the look of things, it would be a lot. A loud squawk jarred her out of self-deprecation, and as she frowned, pondering what the noise could be, a knock sounded at the door. Betty froze, and when she remembered Dave could never show up at her door again, she relaxed. "Who is there?" "It's me, Ryan, and Mike." Excitement replaced the deep sadness inside her, and she hurried to the door. "Ryan!" As soon as the door opened, Mike flew straight at her and dropped a nut into her lap before swooping into the house. "Oh!" Betty picked up the nut and studied it. "What is this?" "It's a gift," Ryan explained, following her into the house. "He likes you." The thought of the bird liking her caused a fuzzy feeling to swirl in her belly, and Betty chuckled. "Thank you, Mike." "I brought food," Ryan said, holding up the plastic bags in his hands. "Please tell me you like Chinese because that's what I got." "I love Chinese," Betty said and laughed when Ryan dramatically breathed a sigh of relief. As they ate, she glanced at him, wondering why he was doing everything right and caring for her when her son couldn't. She wished Ryan's mother was alive to see what a gem her son had become. She had never envied someone as she did Ryan's late mother. "There's something I want to teach you," Ryan said. "What?" "Some minor exercises that you can do to help your legs. I saw them online." "Really?" Betty perked up. "I would love to." "Okay," Ryan nodded. "Finish your food, and I'll show you what to do." "I cannot believe you beat me," Ryan cried, scowling at the chessboard, while Betty whooped joyfully. "Did you cheat?" "Sore loser," Betty laughed in his face. "Just admit it. The student is now better than the teacher." "I will never admit that," Ryan said, reorganizing the board. "It's just beginner's luck. Let's try again." They were playing a chess game, and Ryan had just taken a hard loss. It was a sore loss because 2 weeks ago, Betty had never touched a chessboard. Since they were spending much time together, Ryan decided to teach her on a whim. But with every game, she got better, and today, she beat him. He loved spending time with Betty and had grown accustomed to seeing her every morning. Even Mike, who shied away from human interaction, loved visiting her. Since Grandpa still wasn't home, Ryan and Mike spent all their time with Betty, only leaving her place at night. She was like a mother to him, especially since she loved cooking and ensured he and Mike were well fed. He did his bit by running errands for her and helping her with exercises, but Ryan wished he could do more. He made a move on the board, knocking out one of Betty's pieces, and her shriek of disappointment made him laugh. He was about to say something playful to rub it in when his phone rang. Ryan rolled his eyes and set the phone back down. "It's been 3 weeks," Betty said, "and it's the first time I've heard your phone ring." Ryan laughed. "I don't have any friends," he said, "except you." "You need friends your age," she frowned. "So who was that then?" "My grandpa." The phone started to ring again. When Betty stared pointedly at him, Ryan rolled his eyes and took the call. "Hello?" "Ryan?" It was Grandpa. "I'm here, and you are not home." "Home?" Ryan sat up. "You're home?" "Yes, I wanted to make it a surprise," Pete said. "Where are you?" "I'll be home in a few minutes," Ryan said. "See you soon." "Your grandpa is back?" Betty clapped for a moment, then stopped. "Why don't you look excited?" "I am." Ryan leaned back. Ryan didn't want to tell her that he didn't want to leave her alone. He was worried for her. Betty sensed his hesitation and reached out to ruffle his hair. "I'll be fine. Don't worry. Go home." Grandpa Pete hugged Ryan tight before turning to ruffle Mike's wing for a moment. "It's so good to see you." "It's good to see you too, Grandpa." Ryan followed him to the couch where they sat side by side. "How are you?" "I'm fine." Pete sighed. "I wanted to surprise you with my presence. Where have you been? You never leave the house. Do you have friends now?" "Well," Ryan smiled, "she's not my friend, but Mike and I have been spending lots of time with her. She's a nice woman." "Woman?" When Grandpa Pete looked horrified, Ryan quickly held out his arms. "No, it's not like that," he said, explaining the ordeal between Betty and Dave. When he finished, Grandpa Pete looked livid. "Oh, wow. Well, I'm glad she's safe," Grandpa said. The following day, Ryan set out with Mike to see Betty. Throughout yesterday, he had fun with Grandpa, but part of his mind stayed on Betty. She was alone, with a body paralyzed from the waist down. Although she always insisted that she could do everything, Ryan didn't think she had to. He arrived at her door, and when she opened, the excitement in her eyes was contagious. "Ryan!" Betty's voice rang out like a soft bell. She stretched her arms wide, her smile spreading warmth through the room like the summer sun. As Ryan stepped closer, she wrapped him in a tender embrace, her presence as comforting as a soft blanket on a chilly evening. Her scent was a soothing mixture of honey and blooming lilacs that seemed to seep into Ryan's soul. For a moment, he almost climbed into her lap, driven by an overwhelming sense of belonging and peace. Betty's hugs felt like a safe haven, a place where worries couldn't reach him. Betty always had a way of making every visit special, thanking him with genuine affection for coming into her life and brightening her days. "Oh, Ryan, thank you for this joy you bring," she would say, her eyes twinkling. Each time she expressed her gratitude, Ryan blushed, his cheeks tinged with a shy red. Deep down, he felt a surge of emotions, knowing it was he who was truly grateful. Caring for Betty had opened a new chapter in his life, one filled with unexpected joys and the discovery of feelings he hadn't known before. The more time he spent with her, the more he realized how much warmth Betty brought into his life. Sometimes as they sat together, with Betty's stories filling the air, Ryan caught himself thinking that this must be what it felt like to have a mother. Her laughter, her gentle scolding, her endless optimism. Betty embodied all that and more. One day, Ryan came very early in the morning, which was unusual. Betty greeted him and led him into the living room. "I probably won't be able to stay for long today," he sighed, "but I had to come see you. How are you?" "I'm fine." She looked fine. Her eyes no longer held sadness, and for Ryan, that was the best part. The room was filled with a quiet tension, broken only by the sound of Ryan's uneven breathing. Betty, sensing his discomfort, furrowed her brow in concern. Her voice was gentle, filled with worry. "Is everything okay, Ryan?" she asked. Ryan looked at Betty, his eyes betraying a mix of fear and sadness. He opened his mouth to speak, paused, and then, with a visible effort, pushed the words out. "I think we're moving to another town soon," he admitted, his voice quivering slightly. "It's my grandpa's job. They're transferring him to another office and it's far from here," Ryan explained, his gaze dropping to the floor. Betty motioned for Ryan to come closer. As he approached, she opened her arms, offering him a warm embrace. "Come here," she said softly. Ryan stepped into her arms, and Betty hugged him tightly, feeling his body tremble with held-back tears. She patted his back soothingly. "It's okay, Ryan," she whispered. "I'm thankful for everything you've done, and I will never forget that." As they separated, Betty saw the tears rolling down Ryan's cheeks. Her heart ached for him, knowing how much she became almost like a mother figure for him. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Betty turned her wheelchair towards it, puzzled. Who could that be? She wondered aloud. Ryan wiped his eyes quickly and looked towards the door. "It's probably Grandpa Pete," he said, trying to compose himself. "I asked him to pick me up here." Betty rolled towards the door and opened it, to find a tall, grey-haired man outside. He was distracted, speaking into his phone with a businesslike tone. Ryan glanced at his grandfather and let out a soft sigh. Even at this moment, work seemed to consume him. Ryan raised his voice, cutting through the distance between them. "I'm almost done, Grandpa," he called out, his tone a mix of frustration and resignation. Ryan walked to the door. "I guess this is it for now," he said to Betty, trying to smile. Betty nodded and smiled warmly. "You go on, son," she said. At her words, Ryan felt his heart skip a beat. No one had ever called him son before. He paused in the doorway, his hand on the frame, as the word echoed softly in his ears. It was a simple word, but it carried the weight of all the affection and care that Betty had shown him during that short period they had known each other. He looked at her, his eyes glistening anew with tears. Betty smiled warmly, her eyes soft with understanding. She knew the impact of her words, having sensed the void in Ryan's life for so long. "You'll always have a place here, you know that, right?" she added, reinforcing her bond with him. Ryan nodded, unable to speak as his emotions swelled. He managed a small smile, his heart full. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick. The simplicity of the moment, the profound connection they shared, seemed to fill the room. At that moment, Pete finally turned around and looked down at Betty, who greeted him warmly. "Good morning, sir. How are you today?" she asked with a welcoming smile. Pete, caught slightly off guard, paused for a moment. His eyes widened briefly, taking in the sight of the woman who was in front of him. "Please call me Pete. It's so nice to meet you," he responded, extending his hand in a friendly gesture. Realizing the informality of the moment, he quickly pocketed his phone, which had been a near-permanent attachment to his hand just moments before. Betty noted the change in his demeanor with a soft nod. "Would you like to come in?" she invited, rolling her chair back to allow him room to enter. Pete stepped inside, his smile awkward yet genuine as he entered the cozy living space. "You can call me Beth," Betty said, introducing herself with the nickname that only close friends used. Ryan, who had been watching the exchange from a short distance, couldn't help but feel a mix of confusion. Just minutes ago, Pete had been all business, absorbed in the demands of his work. Now, he seemed transformed, his attention fully on Betty, showing a softer side that Ryan rarely saw. It was as though his grandfather was no longer in any rush to be anywhere else. "This is a lovely place you've got here, Beth. Ryan has told me quite a bit about you," Pete said, his voice carrying a tone of respect and gratitude. Betty smiled, pleased to hear that Ryan spoke of her so fondly. "Thank you, Pete. Ryan's company has been a blessing to me as well. It's good to finally meet you." They moved into the living room. Pete took a seat, visibly relaxing as he settled into the armchair that Ryan often claimed as his own. "I'm sorry about everything that happened to you, Beth. I want you to know that none of this is your fault." She smiled. "Thank you, Pete." Pete, normally a man of few words, surprised even himself as he leaned forward, his eyes twinkling with an unusual gleam. Without hesitation, he launched into a series of questions, his voice lively, a stark contrast to his usual reserved demeanour. "So, Betty, where are you from originally? What hobbies keep you busy? I must say it's a real pleasure to meet someone like you." Ryan watched, amused and somewhat bewildered, as his usually taciturn grandfather chattered away. Betty, for her part, responded with equal enthusiasm. "I grew up just a few towns over. These days, I enjoy reading and, when I can, watching the birds in the park." "And what about you, Pete? What do you like to do?" "Oh, a bit of this, a bit of that," Pete replied, waving his hand dismissively. "Mostly, I enjoy quiet days, but I do love a good game of chess. Do you play?" Betty's face lit up. "I'd love to play a game if you're up for it." Ryan could not help but chuckle at the sight. It wasn't just the conversation that had changed his grandfather. There was a spark in Pete's eyes that he hadn't seen in years. Pete and Betty exchanged goodbyes, with promises to meet again. Ryan and his grandpa drove home to get their things and leave. Ryan was already packed and ready for their scheduled departure. He waited patiently in the living room. Their bags were neatly lined up by the door. Back in his room, Pete was on the phone, his voice a mix of pleading and frustration. "Look, I understand the company's position, but I need more time," he said firmly into the receiver. "Yes, I know what was agreed, but things have, well, they've changed for me here." Ryan heard bits and pieces of the conversation as he passed by Pete's room. Each time his confusion grew. His grandfather had planned this move for months, and now, suddenly, he seemed to be arguing to stay. Eventually, Pete emerged from his room looking a bit flustered but determined. "Something's come up," he muttered, more to himself than to Ryan, and then ducked back inside. "What do you mean something's come up?" Ryan's voice held a tinge of concern as he followed Pete. Standing at the doorway, he saw his grandfather pacing. Pete stopped, sighed, and turned to face his grandson. "We might be staying, actually," he said, trying to sound casual. Ryan furrowed his brow. "Staying? Grandpa, what's going on? I thought you were looking forward to the move." Pete hesitated. Ryan suspected and smiled that Pete didn't want to admit that his sudden change of heart was linked to a particular woman he had just met. Instead, Pete fabricated a story about unresolved issues at work. "I'm trying to negotiate with my managers. They're considering keeping me on a bit longer here," Pete lied, avoiding Ryan's eyes. "It's all quite sudden, I know, but it might be for the best." Ryan nodded, trying to mask his amusement. "Okay, Grandpa, let's unpack then." Betty had only ever been in love once in her life, and that was with Jack, who left her after 7 years of infertility. Since then, she had been too busy fighting so many demons to fall in love. After Dave, she felt like she might be ready for a new relationship, but raising him was a lot of work, and she couldn't pay attention to anything else. When he started abusing her, she dedicated all her energy to fighting for her life and staying sane. Now that Dave was out of the picture, Betty was finally finding herself back, and the first thing she noticed was her newfound attraction to 60-year-old Peter Duncans, Ryan's grandpa. She didn't want to be too forward, but she felt he might like her too. Ryan resumed his visits to her house, and whenever Pete was around, he would come too. When he wasn't, he always called to ensure she was all right. Then there were the flowers that she got every weekend. Pete must have paid a year's supply because even when he wasn't around, she kept getting the deliveries. Finally, she was happy. Every weekend, Pete would be making his way to Betty's house. With a spring in his step and a smile on his face, he looked forward to their weekend outings. Today was no different. As he approached, he could see Betty waiting by the entrance, her eyes lighting up the moment she saw him. "Good morning, Pete," Betty greeted him cheerfully as he reached for the handles of her wheelchair. "Morning, Betty. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Pete replied, pushing her wheelchair down the path that led to their favourite park. As they entered the park, Pete steered them towards their usual spot near the lake. Pete stopped by a vendor and bought 2 ice creams, vanilla for Betty and chocolate for himself. "Here we go, your favourite," Pete said, handing Betty her ice cream. "Oh, thank you, Pete," Betty said, her face breaking into a wide smile as she took a bite. They continued their journey to a shaded bench by the water's edge, where they could watch the ducks and the occasional rowboat glide by. Their conversations flowed effortlessly from one topic to another. Books they had read, memories of their younger days, and their thoughts on the ever-changing world around them. Time seemed to slow down when they were together, the hours passing unnoticed. As the afternoon sun began to wane, Pete bought some candy from another vendor. "For old time's sake," he said, offering Betty some jelly beans, which she accepted with a mischievous grin. "You're spoiling me, Pete," Betty teased, popping a jelly bean into her mouth. Pete shrugged, a playful glint in his eye. What are Saturdays for, if not for a little spoiling? Soon it became a ritual for them. The park, the ice cream, the candies, and the laughter. They wove these simple joys into the fabric of their weekends. One Wednesday there was a knock at the door, and Betty hurried to it, knowing it was Ryan and Mike. She no longer got scared to answer the door because she knew that Dave was far away. She was free. She had always wanted a son, and although the one she birthed proved to be a demon, fate compensated her with Ryan. She swung the door open expecting to see Ryan, but it was Pete. He stood at the door looking handsome in brown chinos, pants, and a t-shirt. Betty cried excitedly and led him inside. "I thought you wouldn't be back until next week." "I cancelled everything on my calendar," he said. "I needed to see you." Betty blushed. "Have you been doing your exercises?" Pete asked. "Yes." Betty nodded. "Ryan helps too." "Beth," Pete shifted closer to her, "you are a strong woman, but whenever I'm not here, I worry about you." "Why?" "Because I need to know you're fine, but you're alone and cannot do everything for yourself no matter how much you try. You need help. I don't want you to limit yourself simply because there's no one around." "But that's my life, unfortunately," Betty said. "I need to learn to be independent because at the end of the day, I'll end up alone." "That's where you're wrong," Pete cut her off. "You're always going to have me." "What?" Betty stared into his grey eyes, a frown on her face. "What are you talking about?" "You've shown me something I've been missing for years," he explained. "Ever since my wife died 20 years ago, I've thrown myself into work, but now I want companionship. Not just any companionship. I want you." "But why?" Betty asked. "I'm paralyzed. I can't give you anything." "You give me everything I need," he said. "Your wits, your smile, everything is amazing. I want to come home to you daily. It'll make life worthwhile." Betty held her breath because she was afraid that she would wake up if she kept breathing. "Beth," Pete continued, holding her hands, "I came here to ask you to please move in with us. My house is big enough, and we'll be a family." At that moment, the door suddenly opened and Mike flapped inside before Ryan appeared. Betty met his gaze from across the room. "Ryan!" "I'd love to have a family, Betty," Ryan suddenly said. "For the past 5 months, you've been like a mother to me. If you move in with us, you'll make Mike, me, and Grandpa the happiest men on earth." Pete, noticing Betty's confusion about their conversation regarding moving in together, decided it was the perfect moment to clear the air. He exchanged a knowing look with Ryan before turning to Betty. "Well, it was his idea, actually," Pete revealed, nodding towards Ryan. The corners of his mouth turned up in a mischievous smile. Betty looked from Pete to Ryan, her expression a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Ryan chuckled, stepping closer. "Yes, it was. You see, I've been giving Grandpa here a bit of a pep talk. I told him he should ask you to be his girlfriend, and even more than that, to consider moving in with us." Betty's eyes widened in astonishment, her cheeks tinged with a blush. "Oh my," she murmured, looking at Pete with newfound understanding and affection. Ryan nodded, smiling warmly at them both. "Grandpa's been happier than I've seen him in years, and I know he's happiest when he's with you. We'd love to have you with us, if that's something you'd want." Betty, touched by the sincerity in both their voices, felt a rush of emotions. Her eyes glistened. I would love that," she finally said, her voice soft but steady. Ryan watched the tender scene, feeling a profound sense of contentment. He had hoped for this outcome, knowing how much it would mean to all of them. "Let's go celebrate," Pete suggested, his voice brimming with excitement. "Dinner on me. Let's make this a day to remember." With smiles all around, a new chapter of their lives was just beginning. In their hearts, they carried the warmth of a family that was chosen, cherished, and united by deep affection and mutual respect.